right, Aloha Summer, Chapter 22. All right. Timing is probably the most important thing. When a fella needs to ask his parents something that he's pretty sure the answer is gonna be no. Well, timing is critical. The Jacobses helped. The fact is, that night at supper was probably the first time I really liked the Jacobses, ever since I got there. That's because Mama and Daddy were busy fussing about them and not hardly paying me much attention at all. Daddy was upset with Paul Jacobs on account of the chaps. He first thought that Mr. Jacobs hadn't been able to get a hold of George Monroe before he returned from the Big Island to Lanai. Then he found out that Paul Jacobs didn't even bother to call him or Captain Sanchez. When Daddy told him again how well the leather chaps protected his legs from the pineapples and how the workers needed them, Paul Jacobs just laughed it off and told him to forget it. Calls them Kanakas, Daddy said. It means commoner or worker. Only the way Paul says it, he makes it sound like dirt. Mama wasn't too tickled with Mrs. Jacobs either. Seemed she was sweeter than maple syrup to Mama or Mrs. Duchance, the French chemist's wife, or to Mr. Foster. But when any of the Filipino or Japanese women came in, Mrs. Jacobs was really snooty or sharp with them. This Hawaiian woman came in the other day, Mama began, walked clean from the other side of the island with about 5 dozen eggs to sell. She stopped, kind of shaking a finger at Daddy. Now we only had about a half dozen eggs left in the whole store, but Carmine up and tells her, real snooty-like, that we don't need any eggs, and they were right wrapped up with their conversation about the Jacobses. Now was the time to jump in. Can I spend the night with my friend tomorrow? And finally Carmine said she'd take them. Mama kept right on talking like she hadn't even heard me, but she only paid her half a cent each. Shoot, we pay a penny and a half for eggs from Oahu, and she only offered the woman half a cent. What really bothered me was the way... Can I spend the night with my friend tomorrow? I asked again. We're going to get up early and go fishing. Don't interrupt while someone's talking, John, Daddy said. What were you saying, Helen? I said that what really bothered me was the way she treated the poor woman, Mama went on. Daddy nodded his agreement. It's the same with Paul. He's always been polite and nice to me or Mr. Duchance. But when it comes to the workers, he sighed. Both shook their heads and looked really exasperated. Can I go fishing with my friend? Daddy glanced at me and cocked an eyebrow. We need to get a real early start on Saturday, so I need to spend the night, okay? He frowned. Just the two of you? No, I shook my head. My friend's grandfather is taking us. He's really a good fisherman. He really knows what he's doing. Daddy glanced at Mama. She was still thinking about Mrs. Jacobs. She kind of stared off into space, and I could tell she wasn't listening to either of us. You know, Mama said more to the ceiling than to Daddy, she's got a whole other set of books in the back room. I saw her working on them one day. Wonder why she'd have 2 sets of books. Nobody has a second set of books, not unless they're trying to hide something. But what? I'm tempted to sneak in one of these days and... Can I, Dad? I whispered. He gave a quick nod in my direction, then went back to the conversation. Helen, you shouldn't pry into other folks' business. Mama shrugged. Well, I really wouldn't sneak in and prowl around in her desk. Still, why would someone need 2 sets of books unless they were doing something wrong? Mama and Daddy kept talking about the Jacobses. It wasn't like them. Daddy hardly ever talked bad about nobody. But I guess the Jacobses just brought out the worst in both of them. Daddy said that Paul Jacobs never did a lick of work. Mama said that's because he was the foreman. But Daddy said as how he'd been with a number of foremen or bosses who worked every bit as hard as their men did. He said all Paul Jacobs did was go around pouring dye into the little pools where water disappeared into the rocks, then trying to spot where it came out. Don't make any sense, especially on this side of the island. I mean, wherever it comes out, it's still going to be in the pineapple, so why bother? What's he hunting for? What's he up to? I eased up from the couch and slipped off to my bedroom. I went to sleep with a big smile on my face that night, proud of myself for how well my timing had worked. The boat was weird. It wasn't like the boat Charlie and I fished from on Whitner's Pond. Made from a single log, Makalai Pukuai's boat was long and slim and pointed on both ends. The inside was hollowed out, and I could see burned or singed marks all up and down the sides. 2 poles arched out from the right side, connecting to another pointed boat-like thing there. Only the one on the side wasn't hollowed out. Kalola said it was what we Heole called an outrigger. The thing at the side helped balance the boat and made it more stable in rough water or when people were jumping around trying to land a big fish. As big as the boat was, it was surprisingly light. In the very center of the boat was a raised spot with a hole hollowed out in the middle of it. Makalai brought a long pole with cloth wrapped around it. I guess it was a sail, and the raised spot with the hole was where he put it in. We tugged and pulled and pushed and grunted until the boat was finally in the water. about waist deep or so. Kalola and I jumped in, grabbed our paddles, and started digging the water. Makalai pushed a few more steps, then he jumped in. The paddles were a little different from the oars on the Whitner's boat. Instead of fitting in onto swivels on the sides, we held these in our hands, and instead of being flat on the bottom, these paddles were like a sharp pointed leaf on the end of a stick. They worked fine, though, and in a moment or two we were well on our way. That's when it hit me, the up and down and sway and swell of the ocean. I felt my eyes flash. I spun to face Kalola and her grandfather. I'm going to get seasick. I can feel it already. I'm going to... Shut mouth, Makalai roared from the back of the boat. Shut mouth and paddle. We get past breakers, I will fix. About 50 yards from the beach, there was a smooth area. Toward the shore, waves swelled, turned white, and broke on the sandy shore. Toward the ocean, more waves rolled in, only to break and foam white against something beneath the water that I couldn't see. But where Makalai let us stop paddling, well, it was smooth and almost calm. See the line where the ocean meets the sky? Makalai called from behind me. I nodded. Kioni Priddle. Keep eyes on that line. Keep eyes where ocean meets sky. I did as he told me. In a moment, Kalola tapped me on the shoulder. When I turned, she handed me something. I glanced down at what looked like wet wood shavings. Put it in corner of mouth, Makalai said. He stuck his finger in his mouth between his back teeth and his cheek. Put there, but do not bite. Can move around in mouth. With his finger still inside his mouth, he drug it between his teeth and gums to show me. Eyes on line, where ocean meets sky, and ginger root in mouth. No seasick. At first, the stuff tasted really sweet, but it took only a second or two before a spicy hot feel hit. I had to move it real quick to keep from burning a hole in my cheek. Don't rightly know what it was. Either the ginger root really kept my stomach from feeling the roll of the ocean, or I was too busy moving it around in my mouth to keep it from burning, that I didn't have time to think about being seasick. Whatever, it worked. Kalola and I spent the rest of the afternoon diving into the pukas to catch lobsters, and not once did I feel the slightest bit seasick. Okay, that was the end of chapter 22. So chapter 23 it is. I don't know if you can see that. Pukas were great holes in the shallow reef. The smooth water between the ocean and the shore was where the reef ran. In places it wasn't more than 4 or 5 feet deep. Then all of a sudden, this dark hole would open up beneath our outrigger. Makalai would keep the boat there while Kalola and I dived in. Some of the pukas were only 10 to 15 feet wide and not very deep. Others would be maybe 40 feet across, and the center of them so bottomless I couldn't even make it down. We searched the edges and bottoms of the pukas for lobsters. When Kalola brought the first one up, it didn't take long to figure what we were looking for. Lobsters were like giant crawdads. I mean, just exactly like crawdads, only bigger. The ones Kalola called Hawaiian lobsters were easy to find. They were a bright red in color and easy to spot in the dark blue water. The slipper lobsters were different. I guess they called them slipper lobsters because if I used my wildest imagination, the things did kind of resemble a woman's slipper. Still, they blended into the rock and coral almost as well as the lionfish did. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out how Kalola managed to find them. By evening, the bottom of our outrigger was virtually crawling with lobsters. They were climbing all over one another and snapping and fighting and stuff. Instead of watching the line where the ocean met the sea, I kept glancing down at the bottom of the boat. I just knew one of the creepy things was gonna latch onto my toe or something. Makalai slid the boat up on the shore, slick as a whistle. Once we'd pulled the outrigger onto the bank, Kalola took 3 of the bigger lobsters and went to the house. First thing I did was spit the ginger root out and rinse my mouth with water from the gourd in the bottom of the boat. Then the old man and I snapped the lobsters that were left in half. We dropped the tails in a tin bucket. In another bucket, we dropped the rest of the lobsters. The old man got a big stick and used it to smash up the heads, bodies, and claws. He kept picking up handfuls of sand and mixing it with the crushed up mess. When we finished, we washed our hands in the ocean with sand and went to the house. I put on my clean underwear, Levi's, and a dry work shirt, then went to find where my friend was. Kalola stood between the shack and a big black pot. She wore a dress-like thing, made of bright cloth. It wrapped around and was tied with a knot on her right shoulder. The pot beside her was held above a roaring fire by a couple of wooden poles and a crossbar. I could see steam rising from the boiling water. Makalai came from the shack with 3 wooden plates. Kalola got a couple of sticks and used them to lift a lobster out of the pot for each of us. We sat cross-legged with the plates in our laps. There was no way I was going to eat a lobster. I mean, the things were still whole. The eyes sticking up on those little pole things were still staring at me. Despite my protest, Kalola and her grandfather finally talked me into giving it a try. They showed me how to break the claws and dig the white meat out with a sharp stick. Then they showed me how to snap the tail open and peel it back so I could get at the meat. I've got to admit, no matter how ugly those lobsters looked, the claws and tails were some of the sweetest, best meat I ever ate in my life. We sat and visited by the fire until it was nothing but soft red coals. Finally, Makalai groaned and got to his feet. I could hear his old knees pop when he stood. Sleep now, get up early to catch Ulua. He turned to us. Kalola have mat for Keone to sleep. She nodded. In big room, then to me. But you can move to the porch if you want to sleep outside. Makalai smiled and shuffled off toward the shack. Trouble was, neither one of us were sleepy. We talked for a while, then walked back down to the beach. There we walked and talked some more. We were about halfway to the big rock cliffs at the east end of Hulapo Bay when I noticed that we were holding hands. It kind of shocked me at first. I hadn't even noticed. Only instead of trying to get loose like I did back home when Amanda Burke got a hold of me, I just kept walking. Having Kalola's hand in mine felt natural as could be. It felt like her hand belonged there. Before the sun came up, Makalai Pukuai quietly shuffled into the living room and nudged me with his foot. I guess Kalola and I had spent more time walking and talking on the beach than I figured. It was sure hard to get my eyes open and follow Makalai outside. I had kind of a throbbing headache, too. We went to the far end of his taro patch and dug around in the dirt beside this little tree. It was still so dark, I was barely able to see the chunk of root he pulled up and handed to me. It smelled sweet, though. Next, I followed him to a little spring. Water seeped from the rocks to fill a pool that was about as big around as our bathtub at home. Then it trickled over the edge of the pool to keep the taro field soggy and damp. You need to know how to do this, he announced, handing me the knife. I not gather ginger root for you each time we go fish. You need to know how. I showed this time. He took the root and sloshed it back and forth in the water to get the dirt off. Taking my hands, he showed me how to whittle some of the bark off until I had a handful of shavings. Again, we dipped that into the water and sloshed it around until it was clean. Put in pocket, he instructed. Take out and put in mouth if need to. This pocket? Don't we need our swimming stuff? He shook his head. Today we fish from boat, not go in ocean. We got Kalola up, loaded stuff in the outrigger, and paddled from the shore before first light. Makaiwa Point was protected from the waves by Lanai itself. It was the very edge of the island, so we could see Maui and the sunrise. Makalai put the lobster tails from one bucket onto big hooks attached to the end of ropes. Once the hooks were baited and thrown into the water, he began tossing handfuls of the ground-up lobster and sand from the other bucket. It floated for a moment, then sank to be swept out to sea on the currents beneath our boat. How long we got to sit here? I asked, feeling the rise and fall of the boat. Not long, he answered. Honu already come. Ulua not far behind. Honu is sea turtle, Kalola whispered from behind me. Makalai pointed. I followed the aim of his finger. Not far from the boat, 3 little heads bobbed up and down in the waves. But when I looked closer, they weren't so little. They were turtle heads, all right, only the things were big around as both my fists put together. They worked their way might near to the boat, and the water looked as big around as I was. Suddenly they spotted us, flipped around, and swam off like a shot. I held the rope, moved the ginger root to my other cheek with my tongue, and waited. Suddenly the rope jerked. It wasn't like a little tug at the end of the fishing line back home. This thing jerked. It jerked hard. Then the rope took off in my hands. I tried to hang on, but the rope whizzed through my grip so fast it held like my palms and fingers were on fire. I ground my teeth together, squeezed hard as I could. The rope stopped its burning rush through my hands. My eyes flashed wide when the outrigger snapped around. We sped off, the bow of the boat slipping through the waves on its wild rush to chase the rope. And that is the end of chapter 23.